Welcome back to the One Soccer Nation podcast. I'm your host, Kareem Rae. Football governance is one of those topics that sound dry until you realize it determines whether your club survives. My guest today is a PhD researcher at the University of Westminster studying whether football's ownership regulations actually protect the people who matter the most, the fans. He has written extensively on nation-state ownership, multi-club structures, the owners and directors test, and UEFA's controlling influence rules, and he happens to support Crystal Palace, which right now puts him at the center of a live governance story. Mark O'Neill, welcome to the One Soccer Nation podcast. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Kareem. Great to be here.
Mark, how are you doing?
Yeah, really good. Thank you. Really good. Excited to speak to you today. And yeah.
Likewise. I'm going to start with my favorite question and ask you, how did you get involved in the beautiful game?
Well, I played football from a young age, and I used to be a goalkeeper as a kid. So I was playing for my kind of like local club teams and that, and I was loved diving around, getting muddy, making saves and all that kind of thing. And I used to watch the likes of like Peter Schmeichel, Gianluigi Buffon and David Seaman and all that. I used to kind of love seeing how those guys used to make all these incredible saves and stuff, like tipping them around the post, they were kind of diving in the top corner and all that kind of thing, and tried to copy them. I often failed, but I tried to copy them nonetheless. But I was also lucky enough to kind of play for the youth teams at Crystal Palace as well as a teenager for a couple of years, and I kind of started supporting the club from there. So kind of stayed a part of me from then. And I guess I've always found how the game's run to be interesting, how it's governed, because I remember kind of reading about things like the Bosman ruling and all that kind of thing, which there is a Bosman ruling allows players to leave for free at the end of their contracts. But when I was a child, that come in the mid-90s, it's like a big thing. So that always fascinated me, and kind of seeing how clubs and understanding how clubs kind of went into financial distress and things like that, and kind of how all that kind of thing worked. So all that kind of like fascination, it led me to do my master's degree at the Montfort University in sports law, where I wrote about the owners and directors of tests and how it could incorporate an owners of last resort concept, where a regulator could step in to take control of a club where it enters in severe financial distress. And that dissertation kind of followed on to my current PhD research, which is looking at the football club ownership regulations and how it aligns with a fan perspective of what makes a good owner. So yeah, I've always kind of like geeked out a little bit on kind of like the regulation, kind of how the game's run, really, to be honest. So
very nice. What would you say attracted you to stay within the beautiful game, to continue working? What was it that made you say, hey, I want to be a part of this game some way, somehow?
I guess football was because there's kind of that inherent kind of pull to it. So it's something that's so simple and so kind of pure on one hand, and you could kind of see a lot of the kind of issues behind it as well, which it's kind of, I dare say, frustrates kind of every fan as well. You're kind of looking at clubs and kind of leagues and regulators kind of run, and kind of it always creates debate, and always kind of you think, why are they not doing X or Y? And so it's always fascinated me of kind of how they're run, and chance to kind of study them in detail and maybe put forward solutions is something that's really interesting to me. So yeah, I guess that's part of it.
Understood. And you mentioned too, as well as like in your early days when reading about clubs and how they operate, you were interested, right? I mean, most people that play soccer or that are fans of soccer or football, they don't tend to go that deep. So was it the way you were raised, the industry that your family operates in? What was it for you?
It probably wasn't anything to do with my family, because they weren't really football fans in any kind of respect, really. Kind of they're quite loose kind of football fans, might watch the odd game, but never really involved. And they weren't like lawyers or academics or accountants or professionals in that kind of respect. So it kind of came a little bit from nowhere, really. I'm not really sure. It's just something. I kind of just kind of geeked out a little bit on kind of like that thing about how why things happen in the background, kind of why things are run a certain way. It's just, I guess it's something that's kind of developed quite organically over time rather than being kind of inherited, so to speak. So,
Very nice. So you're
yeah.
straight within you. Very nice.
Oh, yeah, just me, just me. Yeah.
I read a few of your blogs on your website. You wrote in depth about the Reading FC situation and Dai Yongge's disqualification by the EFL. What that case exposed in your analyst is that the ownership and directors test can only act once a specific triggering event occurs, like an unsatisfied court judgment. So what happens in the years before that trigger? What tools do leagues actually have to deal with an owner who is simply checked out, neglecting, or running a club into the ground without technically breaking a true rule?
Yeah, I guess the Reading case was a very interesting case, and it's kind of like the Sheffield Wednesday case as well. Is kind of shares a lot of parallels to it, where you kind of have an owner that kind of comes in, passes the test, so to speak, ticks all the boxes, but then kind of checks out, and is kind of for whatever reason. I think in the Dai Yongge case at Reading, he came in, bought the club. I believe it was like 2019 time, something around there. Initially, he put quite a lot of money into the club, and he invested quite a lot into the team. As they had one of the highest wage bills in the division. I think just after he bought the club, the club won the Championship playoff final, so like 90 minutes and being in the Premier League. But they lost that game, and then so after then, after a couple of years, he kind of he seemed to kind of check out and kind of lose interest. So whether it was kind of a lack of interest and there were also thoughts that he just had difficulty accessing his funds in China because it's just like kind of restrictions on kind of outward cash flows from China. Played a part in that as well, and so he didn't have access to his funds to actually kind of put them into the club. And because the club was so reliant on the owner investment into the side to kind of cover that wage bill and the transfer fees and so forth, it's like the club itself began to suffer. So around that time he was involved, the average wage to revenue ratio of a championship club was something around 107%, meaning the wage bill itself was more than what that they just spent on the squad, and the playing squad was more than what the total revenue they brought in. So that's before you even factor in the kind of like the stadium running costs and all those other things. The club was making a loss to start with, so it needs the owner to put that money in to maintain that competitiveness on the field. But what the rules at the time kind of failed to consider was that kind of checked out owner, so the rules are kind of reactive. So they relied on a triggering event happening. So in the Dai Yongge case, it was an unsatisfied court judgment in China, which eventually enabled the Football League to step in and say, right, we're now disqualifying you as an owner, so you now need to sell your stake. Whereas before that, they had very limited tools to actually kind of force the sale. So they'd kept imposing points penalties for failures to pay wages or and so forth, or for rule breaches, which kind of more punished the club than the owner, or they kind of put fines on the owner, but they were for someone of wealth, for relatively kind of small amounts in the tens of thousands of pounds, rather. So it's not really going to have much effect. So and bizarrely, for an owner that's checked out as well, he seemed to have little interest in actively pursuing a sale to get out, and he seemed to make it difficult for potential buyers to buy the club as well. So eventually, when that disqualifying event of the Chinese court judgment come through, which enabled the EFL to say, right, you're no longer allowed to own this club, that kind of facilitated the sale process then. So it was only until then that that things could be forced along. So then, and the club were really kind of like days or weeks from going out of business, just because Dai Yongge was so intransigent about refusing to sell, or seemingly refusing to sell. It's a very similar scenario in the Sheffield Wednesday case with the Chancery ownership as well, almost identical in so many respects. Thankfully, the independent regulator that's just been brought in England kind of deals with this issue to a much greater extent. So it allows So it allows the regulator more powers at its disposal to kind of force the removal of an owner who is failing to kind of be active and kind of fund the club and ensure its sustainability. Um, and also the regulator would undertake more regular financial assessments of a club's sustainability as well, kind of reviewing its business plan to ensure that the funds are there for the club to kind of see out the season and further. So it's kind of taking a more interventionist and proactive approach to kind of identify issues before they snowball into those kind of situations you see at Reading and Sheffield Wednesday. So fingers crossed, those kind of eventualities should be less likely to happen. Probably not impossible, but less likely.
Understood. Why does an investor take on a club like Crystal Palace, where the club is in the P&L?
So what does he look at? So in terms of Crystal Palace example, is it what could those? So because they're Premier League club, London based, the access to those TV revenues. So I guarantee you about 150 million pounds a season coming in revenue there. Kind of all the eyeballs that brings in as well. And also for particularly overseas investors into the clubs, and there's like quite a strong American kind of interest in English football as well, because English clubs, even the Premier League clubs, many respects, are considerably cheaper to buy than an American kind of franchise. This franchise in the NFL or the NBA and so forth, where you'd expect to pay billions of pounds for one of those, where in the UK you could buy, to take probably the most famous example, like a club like Wrexham, who were in the English non-league at the time. And so Ryan Reynolds and McElhenney bought the club for something like £2.5 million. And they've put a bit of money into the club over since then. But the analysts now value that club at around £400 million or more now, because there's that ability to kind of take the club that's lower down. You've put a bit of money in to invest into the playing squad, get a couple of promotions, and then that exponentially increases the asset value as well. So the profit for the investor would come upon the sale of the club onwards, rather than through things like dividends or something like that to take money out of the club in that fashion. So they'd make the profit on the back end, and and that's because the English model of sport, or the European model of sport more broadly, allows for promotion and relegation. So it allows that ability for a club to kind of move up and down the leagues, and so it allows to buy that cheap asset and improve it so the entry costs of getting to those higher echelons are considerably smaller than they would be in American sport, for example. So it's that English football clubs are quite an attractive asset class in that respect.
Yeah. I think, Ryan Reynolds and his partner or partners make that look extremely attractive and I guess kind of easy to do. But, from individuals that I've spoke with, for example, like Jordan Gardner, who's an American that went overseas and has operated a club, or let's say even multiple clubs. He had mentioned soccer investments are sometimes not sexy, and
Absolutely,
it's not easy. I mean, it may be for investors that think it's cool, they want to own a club, but may not sometimes know what they're getting themselves into. With saying that, I'm always kind of biased towards the U.S. side in regards to soccer club ownership. The reason why is because, for example, in Division 2 or Division 3, USL Championship or USL League One, or you have MLS Next Pro, those last two I just mentioned are both D3. You can buy your way in and launch a club from scratch, fresh books, create your own logo. Obviously, you want to get the community involved, but the opportunity of starting a club from scratch is kind of cool. And then, where soccer was in America 30 years ago compared to now, the question back in the days, like 15, 20 years ago was, well, will soccer survive in America? And it's proven to do so. And last year we had the 2025 FIFA Club World Cup. This year, in just a few days, we're going to have the 2026 World Cup hosted by, for the first time, a new format. Three countries, Canada, US, Mexico, 48 teams, which will be very interesting to see the outcome of it. And then 2028, you got the LA Olympics, and then potentially 2031,
Of
you got
course,
a
yeah.
US Women's World Cup. So there's a lot of soccer being played in the US, a lot of eyeballs, a lot of attention, and a lot of capital being allocated throughout the US. So I'm interested to know your thoughts in regards to where soccer and football is today. Do you think that Europe is still the way to go for American investors or investors around the world, or is Europe, or specifically the EPL or the UK, still the most attractive model to invest in because of pro rel existing in Europe, or specifically in UK and not the US?
I think kind of England is probably losing a little bit as well, because I think as our investors can kind of see into kind of other European markets. I think say Italy, or the kind of clubs in Spain in kind of like the second division, or Belgium, or Portugal, are kind of quite attractive investments because they're quite cheap, and also in terms of like Portugal and Belgium as well, they have quite lax rules in terms of kind of foreign players and stuff in there as well. So they haven't got the same limits on foreign players, non-EU players, as there might be in the UK, for example. So they're very attractive. Those clubs are very attractive for multi-club ownership networks, for example, because you can kind of park players there for a season, kind of they get exposed to a good level of competition before they then kind of move back to the parent club. So, and I can see there's been quite a lot of a fair amount of deals happening in Italy, particularly kind of around Serie B and C, so to speak, because of the clubs there are quite so cheap to purchase, and there's and it's also attracted kind of like the history and the geography of Italy and so forth, and there's the opportunities there, and it seems quite an undercapitalized market. So there seems like a lot of opportunities there. I think Eastern Europe as well. There's maybe a little bit of interest there, but I think kind of Germany is probably off the table because of the 50+1 element. So there's a kind of there seems to be less interest there. So, but it seems like Italy is probably a kind of like a real growth market for investors at the moment, from what I can see.
Got it. Have you seen the Tom Brady documentary of him purchasing or investing in a football club?
I haven't got round to watching that yet, unfortunately, but it's definitely on the list. I've kind of, I've heard about it, and I kind of heard some of it. I've heard seen some of the highlights come along about it. I kind of remember some of his comments around Wayne Rooney as manager as well. Well, he wasn't seemingly too complimentary about Wayne Rooney as manager there at the time. But then, to be fair, they've done a pretty good job in terms of getting Birmingham out of League One, which is the third division in the UK, in England, and back into the Championship. And they seem to be competed quite well in order to get promotion back into the Premier League. They have been a Premier League club a few times, and they've I was in European competition, I think, around 15 years ago as well, kind of winning the League Cup. They beat Arsenal in the final, and historically they've always been quite a big club. The second in Birmingham, second city in the UK. So there's a lot of history there, a lot of potential there. The alleged plans for the new stadium look quite interesting as well. So they seem to be quite active and invested into the club, both emotionally and kind of financially as well. So they are a very interesting club to look at.
Yeah, I think this leads me to celebrity ownership, right? Because from what I'm seeing, it's ASAP Rocky, Rihanna, Jay-Z, Drake. I think Drake invested in a club in Italy. There's a lot of celebrity ownership coming into pro soccer or football, which is very nice to see and very exciting. I think coming back to Ryan Reynolds in that documentary, Building in Public, was amazing. Obviously, they have that star power, so that's a bonus. But I want to touch on, from what I watched that documentary. You've seen them highlight the importance of building the relationship with the community, the fans, getting their insights. What do they think? What do they want for the club? How do they want the club to be improved? Where do they want investment? as well as I'm not too sure of the right word to use here, if it's the city or the government, um, but the importance of getting their trust because of, as Americans coming into another country, getting the trust. Um, is it the same? Is it the city or is it the government in the UK? What's the right term there?
So I think in term in relation to Wrexham, I think it's you have the kind of I think it's like the local government there,
Local
so kind
government.
of like the local councils, kind of who kind of regulate kind of more kind of like cities and kind of like counties. So counties kind of like equivalent to a state, so to speak. So yeah, yeah. I think the Wrexham example, Reynolds and McElhenney, they seem to be that kind of what I call like a Goldilocks style owner. So they re, they do the usual thing of kind of putting money into the team and the infrastructure. They've done a lot of that, but they've also, as you say, invested quite a lot into kind of like the relationships with the community and kind of like that, listening to the fans and kind of having that respect for the tradition of the club, which is kind of that's huge, because I think it's kind of fans just kind of they want their voices to be heard. Fans generally, they're not consumers in the normal sense. They have that deep emotional relationship with their club. It's like not like you it's not like kind of the supermarket you shop at where, if that one shuts, you quite happily go to another one. If your football club closes down, it has a deep emotional impact on you. So, and can often be part of your identity. So engaging with the fans actively in that manner and bring them on board along for the ride has been, vital to their success, I would argue.
100%. I want to ask you, what are your thoughts on celebrity coming into ownership? Do you think it's good for the game?
It can be. It can be if they're doing it for the right reasons. So, if they're doing it for the right reasons, such as in the Wrexham example, where they've come in and they've actively invested not just financially but emotionally into the club, then absolutely. But it's the same with any investor, really. They have to be kind of they have to be kind of actively engaged, and it can't just be for show. They have to show that they care as well. So celebrity ownership can be kind of phenomenally kind of useful to a club. Snoop Dogg is involved at Swansea City, for example, and I think he's done a lot to kind of build, the profile of the club as well. I think one of the most recent examples was KSI kind of taking a 20% stake in Dagenham and Redbridge, who are a London club based in the non-leagues here. The first day, the day after it announced, I think the club announced something they'd sold something like £2 million worth of shirts or something like that within a few days of him coming on board, just because the sheer scale of his reach, and his follower base, which can generate new fans for a club and new followers for a club. So um, it can be hugely useful if it's used in the right way. Um, as I said, as long as they're engaged in the process and kind of, have that respect, then yeah, I think that they can be hugely important, especially if those clubs lower down the pyramid as well. We kind of need that little boost to kind of generate those revenues for them.
100%. I want to follow up on Reading, were once held up as a model of sustainability under John Madejewski. How fast can a well-run club deteriorate under bad ownership, and what does that tell us about how much the ODT actually protects clubs versus just reacting after the damage is done?
Yeah, say Reading a very interesting example, because it's for a long time they were a very well-run, sustainable club under the previous ownership. They were a firmly established Premier League club for a while in the mid 2000s. Did quite well in the Premier League, but once the owner starts to kind of disengage from the club emotionally, and then it tends to follow that they're all disengaged financially as well. And that's kind of what happened in the Reading example. So once that money stops coming into the club need to then firefight to kind of generate the funds to kind of stay alive, so to speak. So they're the kind of results in selling your best players and, or neglecting the infrastructure of the club, or it can in terms of like how you go about making managerial appointments and all that kind of thing. So if the ownership doesn't have that kind of care and kind of that engagement with the club to ensure they get these things right, or kind of put the funds into the club to ensure it remains sustainable and it can compete, then it can happen very quickly. One transfer window where an owner is not putting the money in to invest in the team, and the kind of a club has to kind of conduct a fire sale of its best players just to generate enough cash to ensure it kind of stays afloat. Then the club, the team becomes less competitive. So the results on the field start to go down, which will then affect kind of like the mood of the fans. So you probably start to lose fans through the turnstiles as well coming to games, and so that kind of has a cyclical effect of less revenue coming through the club as well. So and that can start to have create a vicious cycle. So often it may not necessarily happen quickly, but it does happen suddenly. Where so it's like an owner kind of one day might say, "Is okay, I'm no longer interested." Or if you take the Chelsea example, where something external happens, which means that the club has to be sold. So it's like the Ukraine war um, kicking off meant that the UK government forced Abramovich to sell the club. So it can change in a heartbeat. But so it can be. It's often it can be. It can the lack of engagement can build up, but then it can kind of show very suddenly in kind of like in a certain act, whether it's the sale of the best player or something, the star player, and where the fans might go, "Hang on a second, what's going on here?" So yeah, as I say, it can be very quick, but it's often the underlying causes can build up over time.
Understood. In the US, clubs can fold, especially under, D2, D3. Is there the same type of saying in the UK? You guys call it club foldings? Sorry, clubs that fold. And then the other point I just want to mention too is I was going to say not in MLS, but that's not true. Okay. Because right now, what's going on in Vancouver is that ownership group doesn't own the stadium, is what I come to learn through the news. So right now, there has been publicly an investor interested in Las Vegas, a group to bring the Whitecaps that play in the MLS down to Los Angeles. So there's such
Wow.
thing as clubs being able to move in America. I'm not too sure of the details and how exactly that fully works. But if there would be like a whole rebranding of that franchise, but it's quite interesting. I mean, it's publicly known. It's all on the news. It's on different channels. You can check it out on YouTube. But do you guys call it? Wait, first, I guess my first question is, can a club fold in the EPL? Is that even possible with where it's at now? Or is that more applicable to clubs at lower divisions in the UK? Or does that just not exist at all?
Well, clubs very rarely tend to fold in the UK. They quite often enter what we call like administration, which is when a club kind of is no longer kind of able to trade as a going concern. So it enters administration, deals with the debts, and then gets sold on to another buyer. The last example of a club actually folding was Bury back in 2019. So Bury were a team that was playing in League Two, so Division 4 at the time. And their previous owner, kind of his underlying business had folded, so he's no longer able to fund the club. So he sold the club for £1 to another investor who didn't have the funds to operate the club, and so and the Football League wouldn't approve him coming in as an owner. So in effect, the club was forced to fold. So that's the last example of that happening. So, but what usually happens is a club will undergo significant financial distress, and then I think and then someone else will come in and take the club over. It's kind of like the white knight fallacy. So there's a more kind of ruder way of saying it, but there is there's always another fool, I think is the way they put it. So there's always someone else willing to kind of step in and take the club over. And because of the clubs kind of been so ingrained within their local communities, so kind of many existing for 100 years or more within that local community, so that strength of those ties and that kind of cohesion within the local community mean that people will do everything possible to stop it folding. Another example of Southend United in the UK. So they're a club based just outside London, currently in non-league, but they used to play kind of in the Championship, League One for quite a long time. So they've been in and out of the courts, kind of where certain parties they owe money to have tried to take them to court in order to kind of force their liquidation, so fold, so to speak, in order to get their money back. But the judges in those cases kind of correctly said, it's like, if this wasn't a football club, I would have folded this club by now. So if it had been any normal company, they would have been like gone and kind of folded. But because they're a football club, because they have that special position within a community, they're not allowed to fold. So so in terms of clubs folding, it's like that. It's extremely rare. It's probably happened, and so in terms of the last 40 years or so, happened twice. And in terms of in the Premier League, I mean, it's possible. I mean, Portsmouth came quite close back in 2010. It's the only club to have entered administration while as a Premier League club, and if a club enters administration during a season, they lose 12 points, 10 to 12 points that season. So it's kind of seen as an incentive to clubs to kind of run themselves a bit more responsibly to kind of avoid those sporting sanctions. But it is exceedingly rare because there's generally always someone who's willing to step in and take on the club.
Right. I mean, as it's clear as day, obviously the U.S. is years behind where Europe football is, and clubs folding in the U.S. is a bit different, and there's a bit more of it. But I mean, I would just call it growing pains. I mean, I think, the MLS has been around for 30 years. The MLS is doing well. Will continue to grow. We have one of the best players in the world, Leo Messi, at the moment.
Yep, absolutely, legend. Yeah,
Messi affected that for the last few years. I guess he got his experience playing on all the MLS pitches prepares him for the World Cup. May give Argentina
yeah.
a little edge. Speaking of the World Cup, what are your thoughts on this World Cup? Are you excited? How are you feeling? And what are your thoughts?
So it kind of feels different, this World Cup, to a lot of others. I think there's a strong political element to this as well. And in terms of kind of you seeing how, in terms of like you look at things like the price of tickets and stuff like that, and hearing about things as today I read about a Somali referee at the World Cup being barred entry, having his visa declined and been told to go home and those kind of things. And even kind of like the expansion to 48 teams as well, it's almost starting to saturate a little bit, kind of too many games. So it kind of loses that kind of special kind of feeling to it, it's going to be an interesting one to kind of see how the World Cup goes and so how it runs. But I think a lot of people are kind of like a little bit kind of like trepidatious about the World Cup and what's going to happen. So and I think even kind of you reading about the things about kind of the water bottle situation as well, about fans and kind of initially being allowed to take water bottles in and refill them, and then being told no, you can't. You have to buy new water bottles in the ground as well. For exorbitant prices. When it's from what I understand, it's kind of like middle of summer and kind of like you dealing with high temperatures there. So thankfully they U-turned on that again, but it feels like it's quite a lot of the kind of organisation of it and the commercial element. It feels quite exploitative to the fans. So I don't know if that's the same feeling in the US as kind of if they're feeling the same way about this. Seeing some of the ticket prices, I think was it Ghana and Panama, seeing like the cheapest tickets going for $300 or $400 a pop on kind of these resale sites, and knowing that UEFA's getting a 30% cut of those as well, it just feels grubby, so to speak, and he doesn't feel right. So he's kind of neglecting as to kind of what the sport is all about. He's kind of it's the fans that make the sport, and it's not the executives up in the box. So
Yeah. I feel the way I feel is like I thought I would have been extremely excited and even just the energy and the vibe. So I'm currently in Toronto. I spend
yeah,
most of my time here at the moment, and I go back and forth between West Palm Beach, Florida. But just even what I'm seeing on socials, I don't know if it's just my algorithm, but it doesn't feel like the World Cup is coming to, like, let me focus on Canada. Like the World Cup is coming to Toronto. Like even marketing, like I didn't even see that much.
yeah.
Even cars, like if flags on cars, there's not much of that going on. And we're like, the World Cup is happening in 1, 2, 3 in 3 days. Friday, first game, Canada versus Boisena and Herzen against. I'm butchering it, but they're playing. That's in 3 days, and I just
Yeah.
feel normal. So it's kind of weird. I'm interested to know because I didn't pay like this World Cup. I paid a lot of attention to just because of the work that I'm doing within the industry, but I didn't pay much attention to the 2022 Qatar World Cup. So I'm interested to know your thoughts on what are the differences. Were you excited about Qatar, or what's the
Um,
difference? Yeah,
I guess I don't know. I think the past three World Cups, so 2018 was Russia, so to speak. 2022 kind of Qatar. So those two were they were a little bit sullied just because of everything we know about the bidding process that went into those, and kind of like the huge backhanders and corruption that was going on in the bidding process for those tournaments. So those were kind of instantly almost they kind of had a little asterisk next to their names to start with. And I don't think they were kind of enjoyed in quite the same way as previous World Cups were. I think for for English fans, it kind of like we hark back to 1966 when we won the World Cup in England, and the Italia '90, where we kind of got to the semi-finals and lost on penalties. He's kind of to Germany, and because those were kind of it felt like more pure examples of sport and competition, and whereas now it feels it doesn't necessarily feel like that. It feels like it's become a political tool, so to speak, and it's yeah. So from those kind of aspects, is like there was the sports washing kind of brush that was kind of also kind of painted on both of those previous tournaments. Um, so just Russia, I think is quite obvious. The kind of like the issues going on there, and kind of like hosting the tournament, can help promote the country in kind of like a brighter light to the rest of the world and make them seem not quite so bad. Same Qatar is, significant human rights issues, and there was lots of allegations regarding migrant workers who were building the stadiums, and kind of I believe that hundreds, if not thousands, died building the stadiums, and those families haven't been able to get compensation. And then you kind of take the American, so this forthcoming tournament, so it's not just the issues with ticket prices and things like that. It's so a lot of the underlying human rights kind of questions as well. So you're dealing with we mentioned briefly about the immigration issues facing kind of so the countries are on the banned list. Apparently Iran have to kind of fly in and out for games on the same day and can't kind of stay overnight the night before. That itself has sporting integrity issues because Iran can quite easily claim, like, well, we haven't been able to prepare properly for these games. Our players have a 4-hour flight, have to go and play a game, and again, kind of get straight back on a plane to go back to wherever it is they're staying. I think they're staying in Mexico or something like that. I think so. That's not really fair on them. And then so the situation of the referee, and I think a manager has been barred from kind of entering the country as well. So so there's all sorts of kind of underlying sporting integrity issues going on here as well, and and that's before you even mention kind of like the ridiculousness of the FIFA Peace Prize as well. So giving a peace prize to a man who's just started another war. So it's it's just absurd. It just and so and kind of as I kind of said earlier. So it all feels kind of grubby in a way. It doesn't feel like what sport should be. So and all of that kind of built together is kind of like it's taken a huge sheen off the World Cup. And so people are probably not as excited for this, but if England go on to win, then I'll say it's been best World Cup ever since 1966. So Yeah,
Good one. You know,
yeah,
England, my top four. I'm not too sure of the groups, but I definitely want to see in the semis. I want to see England. I want to see France, Spain, and Morocco. I think those are. I'm not too sure of the groups
yeah,
again, but those are top four top countries. I've been wanting to see England win. I just feel like they've had a good squad and they can do it, but they just haven't been able to bring it home in a while. But we'll see. Maybe they can this year. Um,
yeah.
you mentioned
Mm.
um, that you were talking about the peace award that was given to Donald Trump, which was a first of its kind, and created by FIFA. And yeah, this World Cup is very political. I'll mention this again. I haven't paid attention to any other World Cups, but this one I have, and it's intense to see how the ref that you mentioned is being treated, the how some of the players like Iran, how they're being treated. It's a lot. You would think that there would be some leeway, but I guess not. With saying that, I think that it's interesting, like the war that just had happened, and then that country is still playing in the World Cup. How do you think? I mean, and
Yeah.
we've been talking about fans. How do you think American fans react to this?
Uh,
Is it,
yeah.
is it even safe?
Yeah, I think that, and again, that probably a political affiliation probably ties into that as well. There's a D or an R next to your name. You know, if you're a Republican, I dare say this is probably going to be the greatest World Cup ever, and so and everything's fine. Whereas if you're a Democrat, you probably see it through quite a significantly different lens. It just feels bizarre. Everything you just said, it's just it feels like I'm on a different planet or something, kind of hearing some of this stuff. And I think I read about an example. I think it might have been like the 1970s World Cup or something like that, where a country tried to kind of bar a ref from entering, and FIFA, when it had a bit of backbone, said, it's like, well, if you're stopping him coming in the country, we're going to pull the tournament. And then the country quickly backed down and said, "Oh, okay, fair enough, carry on then." But yeah, so FIFA seems to kind of lost its moral purpose, and ever since it's started to kind of became more of a commercial actor since the 1970s onwards. Um, we've really kind of lost that kind of moral clarity, and it's because nominally it's supposed to be a charity, so all the money it makes is supposed to kind of put back into the game. But it's just the way it doesn't pay tax anywhere. So whatever country it goes to, it gets all these kind of exemptions in law and stuff like that to allow it to protect its IP and to avoid paying tax and all these things like that, and kind of putting all the risk in regards to infrastructure and that on the states and on the countries themselves, who often see little economic benefit from it, while FIFA extract huge profits. And I think one of the notable things I've read about is that certain kind of cities within the state are kind of pushing back and going, no, we want the money up front to kind of pay for the work we've got to do. We're not just going to wait for you a while to give it afterwards. It's like, we want the money now. And then kind of withholding licenses for certain things as well. So it's good to see that kind of pushback. But I think a FIFA kind of gets into these kind of abusive relationships with the countries it kind of hosts these tournaments in, and kind of it's a very extractive business model now. And so it's so yeah, it, so yeah, all of that combined, it just makes this feel a very strange tournament.
Right. I think like here in Toronto, Canada, the city has, if I remember correctly, they have a certain amount of tickets that they've acquired, and they're not going to be selling it at the fair price or the resale the price the value that it should be. I think they're selling it above, which is like conflicting with what the rule that they some rule where it's like not allowing like the public to resell at a higher value if they want them to sell at like the same price that they got it at. I think, if I'm remembering this correctly, but it's like at a city level, like that was conflict of interest because they're not allowing the public to do it, but they're saying, hey, we're not going to follow the rule that we made for the public. We're going to make our own rule, and we're going to sell at a price that we want to sell at because we need it as a city to recoup some of the money back for hosting this World Cup, which is, it's like, wow, right? So I think there's a lot of that going on. And I think the other thing too, I learned, or I'm learning a lot here on this call, but I think that was pretty cool to learn about FIFA, not the exemptions of not having to pay taxes in the countries that they host in. And obviously the pushback that they're getting back from some cities is good to hear as well. Um, there's a lot going on. I'm interested to see, like, for sure, there's going to be a lot of stories that are already going on now, coming out now. But as the World Cup happens, more stories. It's going to be interesting to see how this World Cup is displayed and executed, and the outcome of it and who wins. Hopefully, maybe Ronaldo wins. I, I was always a Ronaldo fan, but after seeing what Messi has done for the US, I really appreciate Messi, and
Yeah.
actually have come to be a Messi fan too, because I was just like Ronaldo, but I've grown on Messi. Messi has grown on me.
Yeah.
And
You can't not love Messi, I'm sure,
yeah,
can you? So
he's still going at it. Like
I
he's
know
still,
I think he barely moves these days, but he still dominates when he's on the pitch. So, but yeah, so he's still going. He's still going, and it's like if you're that good, it's like fair play. The guy's a legend, probably my greatest of all time for sure. So
1000%.
yeah,
If Ronaldo gets one, I mean, we gotta both put them up there, but we'll see. But yeah, I mean, it's going to be interesting to see how things evolve from here and what the next World Cup looks like in the next 4 years will be 2030. You wrote a piece on the Crystal Palace and Eagle football situation, and you support Palace. Walk us through what UFA's controlling influence substance test actually means in plain terms, and where do you think the Palace case lands right now? Do you think they get cleared, or is there a real risk they are kept out of a European football?
So in simple terms, the controlling influence test in the UEFA regulations is where a person or legal entity can directly or indirectly influence the decision making of a club. So it could be things through like shareholding or through like a position on the board or being able to influence the appointments of senior management within either kind of in the exec C-suite or kind of on the sporting side. So they kind of refer to this as the substance test, where often it's through like a majority shareholding, so having more than 50% control of the shares. But it could also be where you've only got like 10 to 30% of the shareholding, so which was kind of similar to the case in the Crystal Palace example, where having that level of shareholding and adding on some level of operational control kind of meant that it kind of evolved into that significant controlling influence. So to add detail to the Crystal Palace example, so there are 4 primary shareholders. So John Textor, which is through Eagle Football, is like the one who caused all the issues there. Held, I believe it was around 35% of the shares in the club, and also I kind of owned Olympic Lyon at the same time, as well as Botafogo in Brazil. But is the clash between Crystal Palace and Lyon that caused the issues. That both clubs had kind of qualified for the Europa League that season. Palace had won the FA Cup, so qualified for the league through winning Europa League through winning that, and Lyon had finished 5th in Ligue 1 that same season as well. So where the 2 clubs from the same ownership group kind of end up in the same UEFA competition, the one that finishes higher in their respective league is the one that gets to stay in that competition, and then the other one gets relegated down to the lower competitions, which meant Palace were kind of demoted from the Europa League down to the Conference League. Turned out quite well because we ended up winning the Conference League, so it wasn't all bad. So, but I digress slightly there because it is so by the start of the UEFA rules kind of dictate that if there are those kind of potential conflicts, that you're supposed to notify them by the end of March in that particular season. But around that time, Palace were only in the quarterfinals of the FA Cup and hadn't and the final of the FA Cup doesn't happen until the middle of end of May. So it's at least a couple of months away, and the club didn't really know that although it was a possibility, that it wasn't clear that it was a significant possibility. I think we still had to play Man City in the final. So that year. I think the reasons kind of like UEFA kind of punished us because Palace failed to kind of adhere to that deadline to kind of put measures in place to kind of deal with that conflict. But during the pre-season, kind of during the early stages of the following season, John Textor had kind of put an agreement in place to sell his stake in the club to another American investor, Woody Johnson, who was Donald Trump's former ambassador to the Netherlands, I believe, who also owns the kind of Johnson and Johnson kind of pharmaceutical kind of empire as well. So although by the time the case was decided, I think it's probably just before that case was decided, that deal had gone through. But UEFA had decided that because it hadn't been kind of done in time, that kind of technical breach of the rules meant that Palace kind of there was still a conflict in place at the time when the conflict needed to be dealt with. So that ended up with us being Palace being demoted to the Conference League, even though the conflicts had been, for all intents and purposes, dealt with and kind of eliminated because Textor had sold his stake in the club. And the real kind of thing which angered a lot of fans and some others as well was that clubs in similar situations, such as Manchester United, their minority owners, Ineos, have a stake in a French club called Nice as well. Both of them qualified for the Europa League the season before. Manchester City for the City Football Group, and Girona, another club within that multi-club ownership network, was allowed to play in the Champions League in the same season. But they were allowed to do so because they put what they call blind trust arrangements in place, which means that shareholding and the kind of the operational control of that shareholding is put in place in a kind of like an independent third party in which the owner of the shares doesn't know who that is. So theoretically, you're supposed to have no influence over that. But if believe that's true, then I think I've got a bridge to sell you, because basically it's a person with the means and influence that these kind of people have, who are often billionaires, if they wanted to, they could quite easily find out who that third party is, who's kind of controlling those shares. And also they could quite easily get in contact with the executives and other people at the club, which they own that shareholding in, to kind of impart some influence. So it's quite a weak mechanism in many respects. It doesn't really deal with the underlying operational influence effectively. And I think they're doing away with that kind of blind trust arrangement from now on. So, and I think to kind of take that back to the Palace example, so it was the inconsistency that the Manchester City example and the Man United example were allowed. So the blind trust arrangements were perfectly fine, but someone accidentally selling his share wasn't seen as enough. And so Palace were punished, whereas the big clubs like United and City weren't. So these kind of felt like a real kind of like inconsistency there in the application of the rules, which I think was the big issue for a lot of people. And so there were two other, at the same time, the Palace decision, there were two other clubs involved as well. So Drogheda, so a club in Ireland, and I believe a club in Poland as well. So both got kicked out of or demoted from certain European competitions in that same decision. So those kind of smaller clubs were kind of treated more harshly than the bigger clubs, and that was kind of like the real kind of big issue with the decision at the time.
Understood. You noted in your article that it seems unfair for Palace to be punished for their success, since they could not have known in March they would reach European football. Is there a structural problem in how UEFA set the disclosure deadline, and what would a more sensible framework look like?
So I think some of the issues I kind of touched on there. So so it's kind of asking clubs to kind of predict the future, especially if their qualification for a European competition depends on them winning a domestic cup. So because there's often no guarantees involved. It's knockout football, anything can happen on a given day. So you can't completely plan for winning a cup competition, because, you can have a bad day at the office. And, this season, Crystal Palace lost to Macclesfield, who are a non-league team. It's kind of like one of the biggest cup shops of all time. So there's something like 100 places between us in the English League pyramid. And so on paper, we should win that 99 times out of 100. It just happened to be that 100th time where we lost. So, you can't really plan for, winning a competition. but it's kind of asking you to kind of be proactive and kind of look, okay, if it looks like there could be issues here, we can be proactive and put in place, I think, which is the theory behind it, to kind of mitigate those risks early. But practically, is it reasonable, that kind of March deadline? Probably not, because there can be so much sporting uncertainty at that time of year about where how, you know, so about where a club will end up. So there are issues with it. In terms of kind of what a more sensible framework would be, I think kind of pushing that kind of time frame back to maybe end of April or may help clubs kind of be a bit more, clarity in how they kind of prepare for those. But on a practical level, just because of the number of, the size of Europe and the number of kind of clubs who could be involved, there's current estimates say there's around 400 clubs globally involved in multi-club ownership networks, and kind of a large proportion of those would be within Europe. So UEFA, on a practical level, could potentially have to deal with hundreds of these cases in a short space of time. So maybe in a sense, that March deadline just allows them time to kind of deal with all those potential cases. But it still feels a little bit unfair on kind of like a sporting front. In terms of kind of a regulatory aspect, um, I think many people would like to see multi-club ownership kind of banned completely, but I think that genie's kind of out the bottle and is not going to be put back in. So practically, that's off the table, like the complete ban. So I think a kind of compromise approach could be to limit these networks to only one club per continental association. So one within Europe, one within CONCACAF, and one within kind of in Africa, Asia, so to speak, to kind of mitigate those sporting risks. I think you still see them kind of occasionally. I think the Club World Cup is like the same ownership owned two Mexican clubs who both qualified for the same competition. Of course, usually huge legal issues at the time. So it wouldn't completely deal with that, but it significantly tamp that issue down and deal with that.
Understood. You've studied MCO extensively across Germany, Sweden, the UK, Brazil, Argentina, and Japan. Setting aside the legal specifics of any one case, what is the core governance problem with multi-club ownership that existing rule books were simply not designed to handle, and who is bearing the cost of that regulatory gap most directly? You mentioned a bit before, but yeah.
I think to a large extent, the rules as written are actually not too bad. I think the issue has been the application and enforcement of those rules hasn't necessarily been consistent. So the core issue which the multi-club ownership rules is designed to deal with is the sporting integrity risk, where the same ownership can control two clubs within a certain competition. So it could go to if the two clubs kind of like are in this playing each other, it could go to one club and saying it's like, well, you drop those players for that game, or it could interfere with one club at the expense of the other. So it kind of affects the real kind of sporting integrity. So clubs aren't playing, in a truly kind of clean competition. So that's what it's kind of designed for, and that's kind of like the real kind of risk involved with multi-club ownership. So the current rules, as written, generally are quite fine, because they kind of do say you can't own two clubs in the same competition, or if you do, you need to have kind of risk mitigations in place to kind of ensure separate governance separation. It's just that they're not really been applied, with any kind of consistency. It feels like. There's also a fair amount of debate about kind of like the sporting and operational merit of the multi-club ownership networks as well. As a lot of the time they tend to operate in what they call this kind of vertical model, where there's kind of be one club at the top, and there's other clubs that kind of sit underneath, which kind of act to kind of feed players up to the top club. City Football Group is probably the most prominent example of it. So you've got all those clubs that sit underneath Man City, and Man City will use those clubs underneath, like Troyes in France, Girona in Spain, Lommel in Belgium, and there's a number of other clubs all over the world, in India, Uruguay, Australia, America as well. So where they can kind of place players, and so it's quite useful, to be fair, for player development. So they can kind of place a player at a certain level to get sure that player gets game time so he can develop. And so, and then they can kind of push him up to the next level, where if he kind of develops, a more rapid rate, you can go straight up to the Man City youth team. So I think Savinho has been quite a prominent example of this. So there are some benefits to that in terms of player development, but it often the clubs at the bottom tend to suffer a little bit at the expense of the club at the top of the pyramid. Chelsea and Strasbourg, for example, kind of part of the same group ownership network. There's been huge amounts of player trading in between the two, and like Chelsea even took like the Strasbourg manager during the season. Well, Liam Rosenior, he didn't last long at Chelsea, but so there's been a huge amount of trading between the clubs there. So the Strasbourg fans are going, like, hang on a minute, what about us? Or we just kind of like a farm for you to develop players for Chelsea? So clubs kind of can lose their identity a little bit under these networks. But to say there are player development benefits there, whether they're kind of financially productive is a different question as well. I think the academic consensus is out on that.
Very interesting. Are you for multi-club ownership or not?
I'm against multi-club ownership. So it's a lot of it feels like it's kind of like it doesn't feel like true competition in many ways. And it can also be like a symptom of the increasing private equity influence in football as well, where they kind of put these investments into lots of different clubs, companies and so forth, and use those clubs as a way to kind of develop the playing assets, which is kind of like one of the kind of the big revenue drivers for clubs, especially kind of those more elite levels of the game. So it feels like it feels like those clubs kind of become kind of bargaining chips, and the players kind of could just kind of get it moved around like chess pieces a little bit, and so it kind of the sporting kind of integrity and kind of competition kind of loses a little bit, in my view. So I would ban it outright, but that's probably not going to happen.
Right. Switching gears, you've ran the Newcastle's Saudi takeover was approved despite clear political involvement from UK government ministers, and that FIFA imposed no sanctions. Your position is that the regulator ended up conducting diplomatic activity rather than football governance. So let me ask you directly, is sports washing actually a problem that football's governance system can solve, or is it fundamentally a political problem that football keeps pretending it can manage?
I think it's probably a little bit of both. I mean, sports washing as a term is kind of quite a recent thing. I think it's only generally been around for like last 20 or 30 years or so. But it's a practice that's kind of gone on for decades further, and maybe centuries or more. If imperialist nations used to use kind of sport as a means of controlling local populations, you think back to, for example, Jesse Owens at the Munich Olympics and so forth as well. So Munich Olympics were mean to promote certain ideologies, and so they kind of all that kind of that. So it's used as a sports washing tool. But in terms of whether football can solve this, it's like, in theory, it's quite an easy thing to solve. You can just write a rule saying that no person or entity who is part of or connected to a nation state can own or be a director of a football club. So in theory, it's quite an easy problem to solve. But then that political element comes into it as well. So countries that tend to kind of engage in these kind of sports washing activities tend to be those that are kind of have more authoritarian type governments. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, China, probably the most prominent examples of this. You take the Saudis, for example. So their huge wealth makes them a massive global player politically in terms of the amounts of money they can invest into strategically significant industries around the world, so the defense industry, energy, and it's put significant amounts of money into into property within the UK and kind of buying companies and that as well. So it's developed a huge influence, which kind of ties into it as well, so it becomes a hugely political kind of issue because of that as well. And I think the Newcastle example becomes like a really good example of this, when the public investment fund, so that's kind of like the sovereign wealth fund of the Saudi state, bought the club back in 2021. The Premier League initially objected to the deal because of they had concerns over the Saudis' connection. The public investment fund's connection to the Saudi state. So if you look at the public investment fund, its chairman is a government minister. So it's and the investment fund is kind of formed within the Saudi equivalent of the Treasury Department. So it has close ties to the Saudi state, and I think its chairman and kind of like and kind of a lot of the executives on that are members of the Saudi royal family as well. So they're extremely close ties to the Saudi state. Um, and on top of that, the Saudi government have been quite active in engaging um, in kind of interfering with the Premier League broadcasting rights within the Middle East area. So at the time, they were owned by beIN, so a Qatari broadcaster company, but there were Saudi kind of entities that kind of interfered and kind of pirated those broadcast rights within Saudi Arabia. So, and beIN wasn't able to kind of enforce their contract within the Saudi state. So, for example, was like Saudi lawyers were not allowed to represent beIN within the Saudi Arabia. So, and there was a World Trade Organization kind of dispute which kind of looked at this and then found that the Saudi state had done little to prevent the broadcast piracy of these rights, which is kind of like the way they put it. So although officially it wasn't the Saudi state involved in doing that, the state had done little to prevent that. So and that was kind of also a significant factor as why the Premier League wouldn't approve the deal at the time, because the broadcast piracy is a disqualifying condition, or is and was a disqualifying condition under the owners and directors test at the time. So, and it's actually a kind of a criminal offence written into English law as well. So that was kind of stopping them approving the deal. But then they eventually have received what they called legally binding assurances over the separation of the public investment fund from the Saudi state. But a couple of years later, there was a case involving Live Golf in New York, so Live Golf kind of, it's controlled by the public investment fund as well. I mean, they've recently withdrawn from it, but at the time it was controlled by the public investment fund. And within that case, the public investment fund kind of made a legal argument that they were entitled to sovereign and diplomatic immunity because they were part of the Saudi government. And now, so you can't be both. So you're lying to someone there, and it's created like an absurdity there. So that was very much a political decision, because as soon as that Live Golf decision came in, the Premier League were going, hang on a second, what's going on here? But, I think the previous kind of Conservative government here in place at the time, which were kind of voted out in 2024, but were in place that had, were quite close to the Saudis and kind of there were in diplomatic terms. And so there was, so there's conversations behind the scenes that may have had an impact on that. That's not known for sure, and but there are feelings that there was kind of things behind the scenes happening there politically.
Wow. It does go deep. It's very sophisticated. I'm interested in just like a personal question. You spend a lot of time Do you spend a lot of time reading?
I've got a mini library going on at home, so so I've got a fair book collection. Yeah, so yeah, I think it's
Just yeah,
part of the job as well. So
a personal question. Is it just you just enjoy reading so much, or do you have like a technique or something? I'm interested to know.
um, I guess I guess that some of it is it's not necessarily reading books, but then it's kind of like you regularly checking in on certain kind of newspapers and kind of websites and things like that. And also there's some fantastic kind of writers out there on these kinds of subjects, which kind of so I'm a bit of a bookworm, so I've quite often got my head in a book of some description. And there've been so many books written kind of in this kind of subject area in recent times that they're great sources of information kind of on these issues. People like Miguel Delaney, who wrote a fantastic book called uh, States of Power, I believe it was, talking all about sportswashing and things like that, and then other books talking about, corruption at FIFA and all these things. They're fantastic sources of information. So I'm quite lucky as for work, I take a train journey into the office, so that train journey can be like a really useful time for reading the chapter or something. So
Yeah. No, I've had phases where
yeah,
I read a lot and then either I stop and I'm like working and building. Like I have different phases for different things, doing accounting. So I need to get back into reading, and I was just curious to ask you that one
yeah.
because no, reading's good. There's a lot of information to be learned. Coming back, you've completed stage one of a global fan survey on what supporters believe makes a good football club owner. You've not gone public with the results yet, so this is a first. What did the data tell you? And were there any findings that surprised you or challenged your own assumptions going in?
There's still some analysis. I'm still kind of doing some work on the analysis of the results so far, but there are these certain things which did come up. So I think kind of going into it, there's certain assumptions about what a fan would expect a good owner to be. Is kind of be expecting this, that financial investment into the club. But I think kind of the interesting things would be to find out whether that ethical dimension comes in, or whether a fan kind of values sustainability over short-term success. And I think that bit is probably the next part of the survey to try and find out. But in terms of this stage, the early finds suggest that fans value owners that have a sporting ambition for the club. We kind of have a plan who will have a go and trying to kind of progress the club from a sporting perspective, who respect the history and traditions of the club, like we discussed earlier in terms of Wrexham, the Wrexham example. And they also kind of value owners which are open and transparent and kind of honest about where they're going, and who bring the fans into the decision-making process rather than just try kind of like shutting them out. So that's kind of been the big things. And also things like, I think like 20% of respondents have kind of changed which club they support over the years. So I think it's 22% have kind of over the years changed changed the club that they support for a variety of reasons, which that seemed a slightly larger number than what I was expecting. The common thing is like you have your club, then it's your club for life. So and it's kind of learning the extent at which geography ties into kind of the clubs people support, whether it's kind of that local area, and it's kind of and that's and also kind of the impact of family members as well as the club that support. It's like the common example in England is a father will tell their son, is like, right, you're supporting this club and you haven't got a choice in the matter, and then they have to support that club for the rest of their life. So yeah, but finding out that those things are probably not quite as common as what I expected. So there's still kind of like there's still a majority there. So it's like, I think in terms of like the geography aspect, I think there's something like 54% kind of supported the club in their local area. Where so it's like football club kind of fandom is becoming a more global thing these days. Where because of like the internet age, social media, the ability to watch TV clips anywhere, people were trying to, and the way clubs kind of market themselves overseas as well has kind of affected that calculation. So people were supporting around, clubs have supporters from all around the world these days, whereas before they just used to kind of be tightly kind of taken from their local communities. So that was kind of like quite a big thing that I saw in the results. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I'm used to the pattern of, and this is more so for me in Europe, which I've been able to visit two times. The last time I was in England was, and I was staying actually in Crystal Palace, was in
No
20.
way.
I was there for 6
Yeah.
weeks on trials, not with Crystal Palace, but with another organization going on trials and showcases. And I truly love England. It's a beautiful place. It's always raining though. I do enjoy the rain. um,
Unfortunately, it has been raining today, so it's doing nothing to dispel that stereotype today. So
yeah, I gotta say
yeah,
too. I gotta mention right here at the top, where if my finger can't even go there, but right there at the top right. You can see a bit the Arsenal flag. I'm
Oh,
not a,
yeah.
I'm not an Arsenal fan, but I got it because Arsenal played Everton. I went to that game a few years before 2018,
Wow.
so I purchased a scarf, and it's nice to see that they won this year the EPL over Man City, because Man
Yeah.
City's winning it. We've been winning it back to back. Aside from my favorite team, Liverpool. So it was nice to see a new team win, well deserved, and then I try to watch a Champions League game, the finals, Arsenal versus PSG. I only watched the first 30 minutes. I just got bored after that. And I thought
It
Arsenal
wasn't
was
the best,
playing.
was it?
I
It
don't know.
wasn't the best.
Did you watch the full game?
Yes, I tried to watch it, but it was, yeah, it wasn't one for the purists, put
Yeah.
it that way. So,
Yeah. I haven't watched it entirely, so I can't say, but the first 30 minutes, I don't know. I
yeah,
don't know.
yeah, yeah, wasn't a classic.
What would you say? Was it because of the way Arsenal was playing, or too tactical, too reserved, conserved, or
Yeah, it felt like Arsenal were trying to stop PSG from playing and kind of play that kind of more counter-attacking style. So they're more concerned with stopping the attacking threat of PSG rather than kind of being on the front foot themselves. So yeah, so I guess that kind of yeah, so it wasn't that kind of like slugfest that you got to see that you got like a basketball style game where it's kind of end to end and lots of attacking good kind of attacking threat and play and all that, whereas more kind of Arsenal were trying to soak up and spoil rather than trying to win. But yeah, so it's yeah, I guess for that reason it probably wasn't the classic. But then again, finals often aren't classics, are they? So
hmm. Are you still enjoying the game? Just if we go back 10, 15 years, are you still enjoying the game as watching it now, or
Probably not to the same extent. I still love the game, but it's kind of, I probably don't enjoy it to the same extent because it kind of, it feels less like sport these days and more kind of like an entertainment event in some respects. So yeah, I mean, there's always kind of like that kind of thing of things are always better back in the day and stuff like that, and so, but I mean, so I think the Premier League kind of has lost a little something these days because it's lost that kind of it's lost that kind of competitive edge really because there's only really 3 or 4 teams that can realistically win it. So the chance of a Leicester happening is slim. So I think it's lost a little something, but it's still good to watch a lot of the time. But I think it's just lost a little something for me. You know.
yeah? When you say the top 4 or 5 clubs that could most likely win it each year, is that mainly due to the budget that these clubs have that affect the talent that they're able to acquire for their clubs to compete?
By and large, yeah. So I've had, academic studies kind of showing that there's a strong correlation between league position and a team and the amount a team spends on its budget. So in terms of like wages, so typically the more you spend on wages, the higher you're likely to finish in the league. So that kind of ties into like the things you talk about in terms of like the teams who have the biggest budgets will often finish higher in the league. I mean, it doesn't always happen, but it happens far more often than not. So it's yeah, I think so Manchester City have kind of dominated the league for the past few seasons, and that can kind of get a little bit boring and repetitive, and fans kind of want to see that real kind of sporting jeopardy that anyone can win. I mean, in the Premier League, anyone can beat anyone on a given day, but over the course of a season, there's not really that same jeopardy that anyone could win the Premier League. So it's yeah, I think those with the greatest financial firepower generally finishes in the top places, and if you finish in the top places, that firepower is then reinforced with the amount of money you make from the league position and then the Champions League as well. So yeah.
Yeah. Switching gears and coming towards then here, last 3 before the fun rapid fire questions. You've been developing a framework that applies the concept of enshittification, originally coined for social media platforms, to football. The argument is that the product quality is being deliberately degraded while extraction increases, pointing to Champions League expansion, the new Club World Cup, and broadcast saturation. Make the strongest version of that case, because a lot of people would push back and say more games, more teams, more access, that is growth, not degradation. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, so to kind of briefly explain kind of the enshittification as a term. So it's coined by an American academic called Cory Doctorow, where it kind of applied it to the big kind of like the social media companies. So, it's like sort of Facebook, Twitter, and, so forth. And it kind of describes like the systematic degradation of platforms. They shift from serving the users to extracting value in the pursuit of kind of maximizing the amount of profit they take. So it's kind of like a three-stage process. So they start out really good to kind of bring users in, so like Uber and kind of Facebook, so everyone's like, wow, these are amazing. So everyone signed up, and it's quite low cost. And then over time, that the next step is they start to kind of shift focus to kind of like business consumers, so like advertisers and so forth. You kind of start to maximize the money they get in, but still able to kind of maintain to a large extent the product quality. And then the last step is where they start to squeeze both the users and the business customers to extract as much profit from it as possible, but neglect product quality. So that's the kind of that degradation aspect at the end. So in terms of implying that to football, so football kind of exhibits each of these. So people so football fans are kind of like highly committed consumers to clubs. So tend to be deeply committed to their club. So they're on board and they'll support their club almost no matter what. And then over time, you see the club starting to kind of raise ticket prices, and you see UEFA kind of changing kind of the Champions League competition to introduce more games. UEFA creating the Club World Cup to introduce kind of more games and kind of in there as well. So it kind of increases broadcast revenues as well. So, and the impact that then has on product quality, so i.e. the football you see on the pitch, is that because players are playing so many games now, and the match calendar is so full up, they don't get as much rest. So they can't play every game. So the fan will often will sometimes not see the best players out on the pitch, because physically they will struggle to kind of play every game. You often see like managers rotating their squads in games to kind of manage the playing commitments and stuff in certain competitions. The amount of injuries that players pick up these days, despite the increases in conditioning and stuff like that. So I feel Ruben Dias at Man City kind of played over 60 games one season. That's and at the pace and the intensity of like these elite level games, that's a huge strain on the body, however fit you are. So and then you're kind of in terms of the broadcast platforms as well. So you know, fans, if they want to watch every single game, they have to sign up to multiple kind of broadcast platforms as well and pay subscriptions. So in the UK, you have to pay for Sky, TNT, Amazon Prime, and all these. So it costs you kind of hundreds, if not thousands, of pounds a year just to watch games on TV. Look at the cost of shirts and the cost of tickets, for example. So the cheapest ticket at Liverpool in 1990 was £4. Now, if that cost had followed inflation to the present day, that ticket should cost £9.60. But it actually costs £39 nowadays. So it's increased by 875% since 1990. And is there a kind of equivalent increase in product quality? And so are fans getting more for that money? Arguably not. So that, it's increased a little bit, but you say the game is 9 times better than it was back in 1990? I don't think so. So all of those things, so kind of tie in. And even kind of like some of the instances at the World Cup, the upcoming World Cup we've spoken about, where, the plan changed regarding water bottles and stuff, and reusable water bottles, where, you're either trying to take them away. So you have to buy new water bottles each time. That's trying to extract more and more money out of the fans, at a time when, many fans around the world who are kind of working and middle class people are facing the pinch financially, kind of struggling to get by financially. And, so these clubs are trying to maximize the revenues they can extract from fans. But are fans kind of automatically getting a better experience in return for the more that they're paying for the game? So that's that in a nutshell. That's kind of it kind of explains the whole enshittification process. It's a slightly kind of vulgar term, I admit, but it's kind of process of kind of trying to take more from fans, but not necessarily giving them much in return.
That is a great break. Excuse me. That is a great breakdown and great insight into, I mean, how much these clubs are extracting from their fans. I mean, I feel that just listening, right, and especially because the World Cup, it just sounds like, and especially the economics right now, the where people are um, at in life, especially after COVID. Um, it's really been on a decline, especially with AI. Um, so where where does this lead the fan?
Great question. Great question. It probably doesn't put them at the top of the queue. Fans kind of can often be an afterthought. How AI kind of affects football and the fan experience is that's an excellent question. That kind of remains to be seen, really. But yeah, that's going to be interesting to see. But I think with the way that football is going, it- I think the focus is kind of more on kind of like a different type of fan. The it's generally thought, but that the casual fan who will go to a game kind of once every now and then, like the tourist kind of fan who might go and visit the new camp in Barcelona and take a game in, will spend more in the club shop and spend more on their visit to the ground than the more committed kind of regular fan would. So clubs are kind of chasing that casual fan to try and maximise the amount of money they can get out of that fan instead of looking after and kind of maintaining those core relationships with their existing fans. So that's kind of like a philosophical debate as well. Is like in whose gate, you know, who are clubs trying to kind of cater for? You know, like, the fans, the hardcore committed fans are ultimately kind of what make the club what they are because of the history and the passion that you kind of see come through on TV screens makes the game what it is. And kind of that kind of visceral feeling you kind of get in the ground when a goal goes in or something happens in a game. That's what makes football what it is. Whereas, you could probably argue that the more casual fans you get into a game, that could adversely affect the atmosphere within a ground because they're not feeling that same level of passion and kind of viscerality and commitment as well, which will then feed through into the kind of what you see on the TV screen as well. So it's a very kind of it's a difficult club balance for clubs to figure out, but it's a great philosophical debate about where the game is heading in many respects.
Mark, there was something I wanted to share with you earlier, but I just remember now. It's something I seen on Instagram, and I think it's well marketed. I think it was by Expedia. So it showed, and this goes back to ticket prices. So it showed watch Portugal like 3,800 ticket price, right?
I've seen that. Yeah,
And
yeah,
then travel to Portugal like 700
yeah.
bucks. That was great marketing.
That nails it. That nails it there. Absolutely nails the whole situation right there. I
Yeah,
mean, yeah, yeah. That's a great piece of advertising.
yeah, that
Yeah,
was smart.
fantastic. I did see that.
Whoever made that was genius.
Yeah,
That was
absolutely. A
great.
million percent. Yeah.
That was like a ball right across the box and just a little tap in, nothing too hard. Um,
Right.
yeah. Okay, so if you were advising the independent football regulator from scratch and you had to design an owners and directors test that actually worked, not just as a legal threshold, but as a proactive governance tool, that would it look like, or sorry, excuse me, what would that look like? And then what are the two or three things that the current framework gets structurally wrong that you would fix first?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the kind of proposed changes, kind of with new independent regulator, will go some way to fixing some of the issues with with the previous model, the previous owners and directors test model. So things such as the ongoing monitoring, creating a little bit more of a subjective and flexible approach to it, making it less prescriptive and less kind of tick box. Um, so it should fix some of the issues. It's a lot of, it expands the range of kind of criminal offences, which kind of like would disqualify someone from being an owner. I mean, but to take a slightly absurd example, one of the offences that it would disqualify someone for would be fishing with a spear, for example. I mean, it's like you know, that's never going to happen. But it's crazy to think that if someone's trying to buy a football club and they were once out fishing with a spear instead of a fishing rod, they could get disqualified from owning a football club. So it's, that's a slight tangent, but yeah. But the main kind of problem with the new model is that it fails to kind of treat existing owners the same way it treat new owners. So existing owners are not mandatorily kind of reassessed, on an annual basis necessarily. Whereas new owners kind of get that mandatory assessment and due diligence done on them, in terms of like in all of the criteria, kind of their background, source of funding, the sufficiency of funding. So have they got the money in the bank, and does it come from criminal conduct? So it's kind of sums it up in a nutshell. So the one thing I would like to see is that the current owners are treated the same way as what the new owners are going to be. So they kind of see that kind of same due diligence immediately, rather than they would only be reassessed or looked at if there was something come to light which would cause the regulator to start looking at them. So that's kind of one thing. I think I would also, you kind of touched on this earlier, so I would kind of outright ban nation state ownership as well, because arguably that's a kind of more risky model than it is kind of like than your typical investor, because a changing kind of political events can mandate that an owner would have to sell the club. You only have to look at the Chelsea example for that, where Russia invading Ukraine forced Roman Abramovich to sell the club because of the sanctions that are being put on by the UK government on those connected to Vladimir Putin. And Roman Abramovich has kind of had pretty close ties to Putin over the years. It's been fairly well documented. He's a former governor of a region in Russia. He made his fortune from the sale of kind of like state energy, of the former state energy company, and which was a notoriously corrupt process. So there are credible kind of reasons why, and that he was closely connected to the Putin regime, and because of that, the British government forced him to sell the club. So he sold the club back in 2022, and the British government and Abramovich are still arguing about what happens to the proceeds of those funds. They just sit in an account, and they can't decide about who they should go to, because the British government is saying they should go to the Ukrainian victims of the war, where Abramovich is saying they should be made available to Russian victims of the war as well. And so there's this big legal battle going on about what happens with those. So despite those connections to the Putin regime, which, to be looking back in the records, the British government were aware of back in 2003 when Abramovich bought the club, but chose not to act on those. So that banning that nation state ownership and a connection would be kind of like a real significant thing for me.
Well, yeah, that's a good story, and it's very interesting. I mean, how football always ties back to politics.
Yep.
Obviously, I've learned a lot, and I was just connected back. We're humans first. It's a human relationship.
Exactly. Yeah.
But when I backtrack in my memory and I think about from a player perspective and playing on field, which has nothing to do with off the field, it's just like that's where the beauty is being able to play and enjoy yourself. And then obviously through time, as you get older, and if you do make it, which is not 1%, it's like the 0.00001%.
Yeah.
Then things kind of change where, you got to make sure you're getting paid to play for what you love to do. And now there's results that need to be met. There's goals that need to be met. And it becomes more political. So on field as it does off field. So just a little side note to myself here on the record that it always really ties back to political.
Absolutely.
To close off here on my last question here, you're doing a PhD, working full time at UCL, sitting on an FA disciplinary panels, running a sports law blog, and acting as a charity trustee. That is a serious amount of parallel work. What has doing this research taught you about how you approach hard long-term problems, not just in football, but in general, that you cannot have learned any other way?
Um, well, it's taught me that social lives are overrated. So, for starters, I don't get much of one. But I guess the big thing is kind of taught me kind of how to think kind of more deeply about issues and kind of and being open to those more alternative viewpoints. And and digging into kind of things further to kind of you learn more of the backstory around things as well. And I guess the big thing is just kind of learning how to manage your own time and that, and just kind of, how to balance things and kind of, and doing what I'm doing now, it's just kind of given me the opportunity to explore my passions and that. So, um, I, I've learned a lot from it, and I think I guess the big thing is kind of it's kind of changed the way I think about things in many respects. I kind of think a bit more deeply about things nowadays than perhaps I did before. So yeah.
Nice. All right, diving into the rapid fire questions. I got four here. So the first one is best ownership structure in world football right now, one club.
I would say Brentford. They're quite an innovative club and kind of quite clever in how they run themselves. They're one of the few clubs, probably actually the only club in the Premier League that have fans on the board. And they, as I say, they're a very smart recruitment model, and and an owner who's kind of a fan as well. So yeah, I'll go with Brentford.
One rule you would add to every ownership test globally tomorrow.
But oof, I've probably mentioned this a couple of times already, but I'd probably ban multi-club ownership.
You've answered this one too, so I'll skip that one. Um, I'll ask this last one. First time investor buying a football club, sentence. What do you tell them?
Run. No, but on a serious note, um, don't just invest in the players. Listen to the fans, as they will tell you more about a club than any consultant or lawyer or accountant will. So yeah, listen to the fans.
Got it. Yeah, that's a good one. And it reminds me of like starting a club from scratch. What we're working on behind the scenes is, the importance of getting the community involved. What do they want the logo to look like? What colors do they want? What do they want the name to be so that they are not just only feel a part of it, but are a part of the process and creating something for the community that they'll be a part of and hopefully be a part for the entire existence of the club, which is hopefully forever. With saying that, Mark, this was exactly the kind of conversation that cuts through the noise and gets to what actually matters in this game. Thank you for bringing the research, the real case studies, and the honesty. For everyone listening, subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Follow us on all platforms at One Soccer Nation, and check out Mark's work at Sports and the Law. Mark's musings. We will link everything in the show notes. We will see you on the next one. Thank you so much.